Hey, welcome to Christians in a Cancel Culture, a podcast where we talk about how to talk about what we're not supposed to talk about, and how to do it graciously, intelligently, biblically. We're glad you're here. How you doing? I'm 𝗄𝗏𝘃.
I'm 𝗵𝗵𝗿𝘃.
Thank you for joining us. We're going to be continuing our conversation today about ministry to people with AIDS, talking with our good friend Bruce Sonnenberg, who was a pioneer in AIDS ministry decades before it was cool for people to be doing that kind of ministry.
And that reminds me of something that God said that shows his heart on this subject. It's in James 1:26. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction and to keep himself unspotted from the world.
Now, there are some Christians who were doing just that back in the beginning of the AIDS crisis. Our guest today is one of them. Bruce Sonnenberg. Bruce is, now bear with me because this is going to be a long introduction, but I want you to hear these details. They're important. Bruce Sonnenberg is the founder and the executive director of He Intends Victory. Now, He Intends Victory is a ministry, and I quote here from their own site, dedicated to educating the world community and the church on how to effectively share real and lasting hope to those infected and affected by HIV/AIDS. Bruce is a graduate of Vanguard University, and he served as the first youth minister at Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa, California, under the direction of Pastor Chuck Smith. That makes, of course, him very special to Renee and I, because that's our background as well. We bless God for giving us Chuck Smith and Calvary Chapel. Now, as the founder and executive director of He Intends Victory, Bruce began with a support group of 3 hurting HIV-positive people back in 1990. He starts off with 3 people in a support group for people who are HIV positive. Things changed over the year. Today, with almost 400 support groups in 17 countries, directly touching over 640,000 people facing HIV/AIDS through direct care and educational services, speaking opportunities, and an AIDS orphan sponsorship program. That's a lot of outreach there. He Intends Victory is an accredited civil society with the United Nations. And Bruce has served as a delegate to the UN High-Level Review on HIV/AIDS 4 times in 2001, 2006, 2008, 2014. Rick Warren has stated publicly, Bruce is a real pioneer in HIV/AIDS outreach. He's one of the first to be on the front lines of this pandemic. That's high praise, and it is well-earned. Bruce, let me add to that, you're a long-standing friend, you're a long-standing partner in ministry. Renee and I love every opportunity we have to talk with you and your lovely wife, Joni, and it's a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Believe me, my pleasure.
Good to have you back.
You know, Bruce, last week we talked about your work in HIV and how it all got started. And I'm wondering what you think has changed in the past 30 years in the way that Christians deal with AIDS. You talked about World AIDS Day coming up and how it's maybe not as visible as it was before. Along with that, how else have you seen things change?
I think the answer depends on where you live. If you live in the United States or Western countries, HIV's become a chronic disease. You take a medication once you're infected. In fact, you can now get medication before you're infected that will keep you from getting infected. Now, of course, the medication is very expensive. It still runs about $2,000 to $3,000 a month.
Wow.
That's all supplemented by insurance and government funds and so on. But in the West, HIV is a chronic disease. So it's looked upon as almost something we ignore. You see advertisements for it on television, for the medications. You see it's okay. Everything's okay. Well, it's not. The medications are still very toxic. I mean, they're tough on your body. It's not an easy thing. You have to take them the rest of your life every day. If you don't take them, you will die. But overall, in the West, it's a okay life. if you're in much of the rest of the world, it's a whole different story.
Mm-hmm.
There, you're dependent on everything around you. Your world is what you grow, or what you can sell, or what you can make, or what you can steal. And if you're HIV positive, you might be able to get the medications at a local clinic for free, but it's very difficult to have food to eat to be able to take the medications. If you don't have food in your stomach when you take the medications, it ulcerates your stomach. And eventually you just start pushing back. So we have many widows or mothers or grandmothers who, when you have enough food for one day for 4 people and you have 5 grandchildren, they won't take any food because they'll have their children eat. They may only eat once every 2 or 3 days. Well, when you take medication on that, it's very painful. So they stop taking their medication, not realizing that when they stop it, the virus builds up in their system, their immune system, and eventually they'll die.
You know, you're
So,
bringing up an important point in ministry to anybody. You got to consider the context. You
yes,
don't minister to people in a cookie cutter way. Jesus
that's right.
responded to people according to their need and according to their situation. And this is a good
Amen.
example. I mean, if you're ministering to someone in a third world country who has just learned that he's HIV positive, there's a good chance you're going to need to deal with emotions that are related to mortality, because this person is going to seriously consider that he may die.
That's right.
If you're ministering to someone in the US, and I think most of our viewers are dealing with people within the US, somebody today, 2021, finds out that he or she is HIV positive. What sort of an emotional reaction do they tend to have? What tends to come up?
I would say that they have this almost a shock. It's still a shocking thing to hear,
Mm-hmm.
but immediately they're told, but there are medications available where you will have a fairly long and healthy or normal life. And so any kind of sense of fear tends to be eradicated at the same moment that you're hearing that you're HIV positive.
Do you think
And
that is
so,
leading some people to be casual about this?
absolutely, no
Mm-hmm.
question about it. There's a casualness amongst, especially in the gay community, there's a casualness about HIV. And of course, this is like anything else. Every generation has to be taught. And
Good
so
point.
That's right.
the
Good
new
point.
generation is very cavalier about it. Oh yeah, I'm HIV. It's almost a cool thing in amongst the gay community to be HIV positive, and you take pill and all that. But it's a confusing social issue. Yet under the umbrella that it's all okay, you're all right.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I know that you brought up the idea of the commercials for the HIV medication. They're kind of glamorous and, they're, I'm trying to think of the thing. They're sort of up elevated, that your life is actually elevated in
Yeah,
a way they sort of glamorize it, I
almost
think.
popular.
Uh-huh.
And that's a huge danger because it's candy coating this very deadly disease. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it still will kill you. It's just that it's suppressed in your immune system. And the good news is if you're HIV positive and you take the medications, you most likely will not infect anyone else. They found
Right.
that by taking the medications, you're not infectious. Well, that's good news, but it also gives opportunity to be infected more.
Mhm.
And so it's it's a confused time, but
Well,
it's
it's
like
kind of
our
a double-edged
society.
sword.
It is.
I mean, on the one hand, I am so grateful that we have medication today for people who are
Amen.
HIV positive. I'm so grateful that it is no longer a death sentence, but good night. I remember like it was yesterday,
Yeah.
the days when it was a death sentence, and the idea of anybody being casual about being infected
Mhm.
is pretty scary, because again,
Yeah.
this still is a life or death issue.
Yeah. And you must remember then the early days of the radical gay groups like ACT UP and Queer Nation. We were talking a little bit about that earlier.
Yeah.
Did you ever get pushback from those groups? And
Well,
how did you handle it?
Yeah, early on, I mentioned the last time when we were together, we went to a conference, an HIV and AIDS conference in Berlin. 𝗵𝗂𝗃 and I went. Herb was a former homosexual. He lived in the life for 10 years. He was infected with HIV. Didn't know it when he finally came out. He had gone through some counseling and he had met a young woman. He was going to get married and he had to be tested to get married. And he found out he was HIV positive.
Mm.
And he had actually had AIDS at that point. Anyway, the Lord worked in his life, and he came on fire for Jesus with HIV. I mean, you remember Herb?
Yeah,
Well,
we do.
Nobody who met Herb
We'd
ever
forget
forgot
him.
him.
No.
that was the truth. He would say whatever he
Wonderful
wanted.
guy.
And so we were at this conference in Berlin, and ACT UP, which is this militant group of primarily homosexuals, but some non, but kind of a modern day Black Lives Matter
Hmm.
at that time. They rose up and they would disrupt these conventions. And this was their favorite. So Tommy Thompson was speaking. He was the United States Secretary of Health. And as he spoke, he was interrupted by ACT UP. And they would come in with whistles, and some would have nuns' uniforms on, and or
Yes, I
costumes,
remember.
and all this disruption. And Herb sat there and started shouting, "ACT UP, sit down. ACT UP, sit down." And there's 8,000 people here in this auditorium, and all this racket is going on, and it ends up that the journalists heard Herb. We weren't far from where the journalists were sitting, and all these cameras and microphones all of a sudden all started running towards us as Herb was saying, "ACT UP, sit down." And they suddenly focused on Herb, and they say, "Why are you saying this?" And he said, "Because it's disrespectful." He says, "We have a message here. There's a message, but we're not getting the message across because we're being disrespectful." And
Well,
so
this
people
was so
asked him,
typical of Herb's shy nature.
it was.
That guy never met a microphone he didn't like.
Well, but out of this came an invitation to go speak with the ACT UP people. And so Herb went in and sat down and talked to them. And out of that came a friendship with, quote unquote, the enemy. They weren't our enemies at all. They had their agenda, which they were promoting, but they recognized after talking and learning what we were doing that we were serving those who were HIV positive and had AIDS, that we were helping in every way we could. And that I personally had been with many, many people who died of HIV, and it made no difference to me if they were homosexuals or not. It made a difference that they were people who needed to hear that Jesus loved them.
Right.
You know, Bruce,
Right.
I'm always interested in looking at the takeaway from these early experiences because
Mhm.
I've often thought today, we look at the radical groups,
Yeah.
Antifa, Black Lives Matter, the social justice warrior movement. They use the same sort of mob tactics that
Yeah.
ACT UP and Queer Nation used back in the 80s and in the early 90s. The intimidation tactics, the disruption, block traffic, shout people down. It really is basically the same spirit, if you
It
want to
is.
look at it that way. And what's significant to me is that on the one hand, Herb and you really, but certainly Herb, stood up to them. I mean, nobody
Yes.
was won over by caving to them. Nobody was won over by you just saying, "Oh, all right, we'll be good and you can bully us," and so forth. He said, "This is wrong," which reminds me of Paul the Apostle standing up and saying, "I'm not going to be silenced," or even when he was arrested saying, "You're not going to lay a stripe on me. I'm a Roman citizen. There's a boundary here that I'm going to enforce." By the same token, there was a willingness to dialogue. And this is something that I'm trying to remember. And I've tried to, in this podcast and in the book I wrote, which the podcast is based on, I've said, the agenda is the enemy. The people are not.
Right.
That's right.
Those are two very different things. It's sort of a riff
Sure.
on the old "we hate the sin, we love the sinner," which is overused, but still, the agenda we should resist. But just like the Pharisees, that, you know, as a group, my word, they loathed Jesus, but there was always a Nicodemus in the bunch.
That's
Right.
right.
There were people who could be reasoned with. You could establish a conversation, and when we're ready to write people off, we need to remember what you just said. You can withstand the agenda, but still recognize the humanity of the people and see where you can find some common ground and relate. That to me is
Because,
an important takeaway.
and that's what the love of Jesus should compel us to do.
Hmm.
Right.
It's we want to see the person. That hurt person might become a hurtful person.
Exactly.
That
Exactly.
pain person might become somebody who administers pain. I have a grandson who, in essence, hates us now because we're Christians. You know,
Mhm.
he swallowed the pill of the left, and he's just. I've got a couple of grandsons that need to know who Jesus is, and I love them with my whole heart. But the fact is that we've become the enemy to him, and yet we've done nothing to show him but love. And so,
Yeah.
Joan, and I pray for him and them. We pray that God will work in their lives in such a way that either before we die or even after we die, that they would see how much Jesus really loves them.
Absolutely.
And so you don't react with anger back at them. You respond in love.
Right. You know, I noticed that so much of like what you were saying, it's like there's the sin that causes the suffering, and then there's the suffering that causes the sin. It's this circular
Yeah.
thing.
Hmm.
And if we don't change the way we look at people and look at them as somebody who's suffering, who needs Jesus
Yeah.
for refuge, or somebody who's sinning who needs his grace, one of those things Jesus can do for those people. But if we don't
That's right.
change the
And the
way we
amazing
look at people,
and the amazing thing is that everybody suffers.
right?
Yes.
Everybody in the
Everybody.
world.
Yeah.
We all suffer. It's just that with HIV, the suffering became kind of visible.
Right. Right.
Extremely.
You were HIV positive. And
Right.
so people didn't
Right.
want to say anything for a long time. They'd just be quiet about it. Now, we still see that around the world. It's still stigmatized. In many of the countries we work in Africa, you're kicked out of your church if you're HIV positive. Your kids
Right.
can't go to the public school or the private school. You lose your job. Those are all still parts of their lives every day today.
And
But
Hmm.
for us,
do
it's
you
different.
think now have people asked you, like you're talking about being kicked out of their churches, even in Africa and different countries, and probably early on, at least,
You're
here in the
definitely,
US.
no question about
Um,
it.
did you ever have anybody ask you, an AIDS patient, if this was because God was punishing him and sending him to
Sure.
hell and all
Yeah.
that? And how did you respond to that?
I'd say my response to people who say this was God's punishment is, well, then is breast cancer God's punishment on women?
Good point.
Is
Hmm.
prostate
Good
cancer
point.
God's punishment on men?
Hmm.
I said, that's ridiculous. We live in a sinful world, and the effects of living in a sinful world is disease.
Hmm.
And it affects the righteous and the unrighteous. It affects
Hmm.
the sinner and the non-sinner, if there is such a thing. It affects us all, but the effect of it doesn't define who we are. And
Right.
and so we must reach out to everyone with that kindness of Jesus, the love of Jesus. I remember this.
Bruce,
Oh, go ahead.
the early days of the AIDS epidemic, I think they provided us with a lot of lessons, a lot of takeaway points.
Hmm.
And one of them you have already brought out, and that is, how do you respond to people who are bullying,
Yeah.
who are trying to shout you down and shut you up? Now, I know somebody listening is thinking this, so I'll just go ahead and ask it, because speaking of parallels between then and now, of course, today we have COVID.
Yeah.
Hmm.
You were there from the beginning of HIV, and of course, you've been there from the beginning of COVID. Any parallels that you see, anything we can learn from the early days of the AIDS epidemic that we can apply to the situation we're facing today?
I was a fighter back then. I'm still a fighter.
That you
So
are.
I look I try to look at the facts, as much of them as I can, without the emotion. And because we get confused with emotion. Emotion is a
Right.
wonderful thing. We need emotion. Life would be boring without emotion. But we also have to set aside emotion at times. And so when we look at COVID and we see that we're getting all these different facts from all over the place, and
Mm-hmm.
it's so confusing. Fauci said this. A lot of these guys early on, Bob Redfield, who was the head of the CDC under Trump and through COVID, Debbie, oh no, I can't remember her last name. The lady, the blonde lady, I've known her for years. I've known both Bob and her for many, many years. Fauci was the head of HIV stuff for years.
I remember him from those days, yeah.
So we're hearing all this stuff and back and forth, and it's confusing. It just reminded me HIV and AIDS over again. This is
Hmm.
and what we're doing is we're getting caught up in the emotion of it instead of
Mhm.
saying, "Wait, you're wrong there. You're wrong." I had someone tell me yesterday, I had 3 friends die of COVID, and it's a deadly disease. And I said, it's not a deadly disease. On a scientific level, only 1% of people die
Hmm.
on a scientific level. But for the 1%, it's a very sad thing for their families,
Of course.
and it hurts. But if you want to look at it from a broader level, you have to say it's not a deadly disease. But we don't want to do that. We want to get our agendas in there. We want to get our emotions in there. And this time it happens to be on the Democratic side or the liberal side.
Hmm.
And so then everybody do what you're supposed to do. So I'm a fighter. If you tell me I have to wear a mask everywhere, I'm going to say, why?
Mhm.
Hmm.
And I'm going to say, what right do you have to tell me that?
Yeah.
Because
Mhm.
I've learned that somebody has to fight for the little guy. Somebody has to make a stand. I'm big, you can see, I'm a big guy. I can handle being shot at. I've been shot at many times in that, not in physical sense, thankfully, but in the emotional and social sense. People want to come
Mhm.
against me publicly. I don't mind. Yeah, I can handle
Hmm.
it. They want to
Hmm.
say, accuse me of this or that. Years ago, I ran for the hospital board in Palm Springs on the agenda of abortion is wrong. And
Hmm.
I remember my opponent came saying all kinds of horrible things about me. And that I was never involved in politics before. And afterwards, I lost, and that was okay. I was fine. But afterwards, my opponent's manager came to me and said, the person I work for, I want you to know that if you run again, she'll support you, because even through everything you said, everything we said, you didn't flinch.
I'll be darned.
And I said, well, thank you for that. I just wish she hadn't said those things about me that weren't true.
Uh-huh.
But if
Right.
they do, they do.
Well, I
Hmm.
think there's a certain level of respect that comes from, having the integrity not to flinch. You
Right.
know what's true, and you know the love of God, and you know what's right,
But
and
you
you
have to
know
be
that
educated. You
that's
have to
right.
be educated to do that.
Right. Now
You
that
do.
brings up an important point, because you're
Absolutely.
reminding me of what the Proverbs say: when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his
Yeah.
enemies
Yeah.
to be at peace with him. It
Yeah.
seems
That's
to
right.
me, if the church today is going to be a prophetic voice, we need to be emphasizing revealed truth and verifiable facts. If
Absolutely
we're
Right.
right.
doing it right, we'll start with the revealed truth. What has God said about this?
That's right.
We are a fallen world.
That's right.
Disease is a part of the experience that comes along with being human in a fallen world. What is moral is moral. What is immoral, and that is unchanging. And all of that is wrapped up in revealed truth.
And now add to that Facebook. and,
Oh, well,
and,
good
Reveal
grief. Don't
truth.
get me started on that,
and all
But
of those things. And all this is passed around and passed around.
that's why I
And
say verifiable facts. If
absolutely
we
right.
are if we're doing it right, we're going to look at the verifiable facts whether or not they are convenient to us politically. I mean,
That's
I
right.
make no bones about the fact that I am a social, political, and theological conservative. That does not mean I have the luxury of saying that somebody is right in what they say just because they too are a social, political, or theological conservative. Truth is
Preach it.
truth, facts are facts. So we go with the revealed truth,
Right.
then we go with verifiable facts. And I think if we're doing that, then we are responsible as a prophetic voice during a controversial time. And good night.
That's right.
2021 is nothing if not a controversial time. One last question for
Mhm.
today, and this is more on the personal line, but I just would love to know if I can get inside your head. Man, so much of what you said turned out to be true. Okay, you were talking about grace and truth at a time when people were talking more about truth from a rather judgmental perspective. You talked about both. You talked about the need for a compassionate response, a balanced response. At that time, you were a voice crying in the wilderness. Well, I mean, come on, over the decades, it's become almost cool. It has become very cool to be involved in AIDS ministry. It's been cool to show
Mm-hmm.
compassion, blah, blah, blah. Do you ever feel like just standing up and saying, "Yeah, I told you so"? Is there any of that go? Does any of that go on?
Now, do you think I would tell you that now in front of everybody?
I
Absolutely,
was hoping
yes.
you would.
Yes,
I
I
was
do
hoping
feel
you
that
would.
sometimes. I think
I,
sometimes I think, why didn't you just listen to what I said? But
no
then, of course,
kidding.
I was learning too, and
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to. What was inside me was I wanted to be honest with people. I want to be transparent with everyone, but I want the truth because the truth of Jesus is over me, and I want true things to come under that truth of Jesus so I can
Mm-hmm.
share the truth with people.
Right.
And
Mhm.
if I'm sharing things that aren't true but are just emotionally mixed with opinions, then I'm not really speaking the truth.
Boom. You know, my appreciation goes out to anyone who is speaking truth. Absolutely.
That's right.
But I have a specific respect going out to those who were speaking truth when truth was very controversial
Yes.
and hard to speak. You are
Yeah.
one of those guys, and that's why I've said before, I'll say again, you are absolutely one of my heroes. Hey, if someone wants to get in touch with you or learn more about 𝗕𝗏𝗄𝗏's victory, what's the
Yeah.
best way to reach you or the organization?
Yeah, well, 𝗕𝗏𝗄𝗏victory.org. And might I
Okay.
say, we do a lot of things around the world with helping people with HIV, providing food and clothes and shelter and microeconomics and goats and all thousands and thousands of hundreds of thousands of people are touched by the ministry today. And it comes from people primarily in America who have a heart for people with HIV and AIDS. So
Fantastic. And again, this
𝗕𝗏𝗄𝗏victory.com.
started with a group of 3 hurting people.
It did. And we have almost 500 support groups on.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I just praise God for your just your faithful obedience and your passion for the truth and your love for people and how you pioneered that.
That's
What
why
a
we've always gotten
testimony.
along. That's why we get along well together and always have. We stand together in what the Lord wants to do in our
Right.
lives. And I appreciate the two of you for the very same reason. So
Thank
God
you.
bless you.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you so much for being with us. We sure appreciate having you here.
You're welcome.
And we want to thank you for joining us as well. We're here every week. And, like any podcast, we are always looking for subscribers. So if you haven't yet hit that subscribe button, won't you do it today? And in the comments, let me know that you subscribe so that I can thank you personally. Also, if you would like to partner with us financially, if you want to find out how to partner in a way that you can help us to go on providing free content online, just go to jdallas.com/giving, jdallas.com/giving. We'd love to have you partnering with us. Well, we'll see you next week. Meanwhile, let's keep in mind the advice that Paul gave to Timothy about speaking truth. The servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle to all, apt to teach, patient, in meekness, instructing those who oppose themselves, if perhaps God will grant them repentance according to the knowledge of the truth. Hey, let's always remember when it comes to speaking truth, it is not just where you stand, it is also how you stand. Thanks for being with us. God bless.